June 18, 1815. 2,500 British heavy cavalry are thundering across the muddy fields of Waterloo, led by General William Ponsonby. In the next 20 minutes, they'll shatter 14,000 French infantry, capture 2 Imperial Eagles, and achieve what Wellington would call the finest cavalry charge in British history. Then, almost immediately, they'll be destroyed by their own success. Ponsonby himself will die in the mud, cut down by French lancers whilst trying to rally his scattered, exhausted men. This is the story of Britain's most brilliant cavalry commander, a man who understood cavalry warfare better than anyone in Wellington's army, who led the charge that broke Napoleon's main attack at Waterloo, and who couldn't survive the chaos his own tactical genius created. It's the story of how cavalry warfare's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness, and how one man's triumph became his tragedy in the space of 30 minutes. If you want to understand how brilliance and disaster can be separated by a single fatal flaw, hit that like button and subscribe. William Ponsonby was born in 1772 into exactly the sort of family that produced British generals: Irish Protestant ascendancy, politically connected, militarily distinguished, and wealthy enough to purchase the commissions that opened doors to command. His father, also William Ponsonby, sat in Parliament and moved in circles where military careers were expected of younger sons. But young William wasn't the typical cavalry officer who bought his way into command through family money and then learned tactics through trial, error, and the deaths of subordinates. He was a reader, a thinker, someone who studied Frederick the Great's cavalry tactics and analysed why charges succeeded or failed throughout military history. He purchased his commission as a cornet in the 5th Dragoon Guards in 1794, just as Britain was sliding into the wars against revolutionary France that would consume the next 2 decades. The purchase system was straightforward. Wealthy families bought ranks for their sons, and competence was optional. But Ponsonby combined privilege with genuine ability, which made him unusual among British cavalry officers of his generation. Most cavalry commanders were known for courage, dash, and a tendency to charge at anything that moved. Ponsonby was known for thinking before charging, for understanding that cavalry was a precision instrument that could win battles if used correctly and lose them just as easily if wasted. His career through the Peninsular War built a reputation for reliability and tactical intelligence. He commanded cavalry in battles where Wellington learned to trust his judgment about when to commit horsemen and when to hold them back. Wellington had complicated feelings about cavalry. He admired their shock power, but despised their tendency to become uncontrollable once they tasted victory. Ponsonby seemed to understand this tension, which is probably why Wellington gave him command of the Union Brigade when the army assembled in Belgium in 1815 to face Napoleon's return from Elba. By June 1815, Ponsonby was 43 years old, a major general commanding one of the most important cavalry formations in the British Army. He was married with children, which meant he had more to lose than the young bachelor officers who saw war as adventure. He'd spent 2 decades studying how to use cavalry effectively, reading military theory, and learning from battlefield experience. His appointment to command the Union Brigade wasn't just nepotism or purchase. Wellington wanted someone who wouldn't waste Britain's heavy cavalry in a pointless charge, someone who understood that timing was everything in cavalry warfare. What Ponsonby understood, perhaps better than any other British cavalry commander at Waterloo, was that heavy cavalry had one job: break enemy infantry formations at the decisive moment. Not chase broken enemies into the countryside. Not pursue fleeing soldiers beyond the point where you could reform. Break the formation, shatter the attack, then get back to your own lines before the enemy's reserve cavalry could counterattack. It was a simple concept that proved nearly impossible to execute because it required disciplined soldiers to stop in the middle of victory, to resist the urge to pursue and kill when their blood was up and the enemy was running. Ponsonby knew all this. He'd read the histories of cavalry charges that succeeded brilliantly only to be destroyed in the pursuit. He'd studied the problem from every angle. On June 18, 1815, he was about to discover that knowing what should be done and actually doing it in the chaos of battle were 2 entirely different things. and that gap between theory and practice would kill him. The Union Brigade wasn't just another cavalry formation. It was a deliberate political and military statement wrapped in regimental colours. 3 regiments: the 1st Royal Dragoons representing England, the 2nd Royal North British Dragoons known as the Scots Greys representing Scotland, and the 6th Inniskilling Dragoons representing Ireland. The name itself, Union Brigade, celebrated the United Kingdom's component nations fighting together, which was lovely symbolism, but also reflected hard tactical reality. These were Britain's heavy cavalry, the shock troops designed to smash through infantry formations through sheer mass and momentum. Heavy cavalry meant exactly that. Heavy. The horses were large draft animals, 16 hands or more, bred for size and strength rather than speed. The men were typically bigger than average infantry soldiers, wearing reinforced jackets and carrying heavy cavalry swords weighing 3 pounds or more. The Scots Greys were particularly famous, mounted on grey horses that made them instantly recognisable on any battlefield and probably quite easy for enemy artillery to target. Each regiment brought its own fierce pride and competitive spirit. The Royal Dragoons traced their lineage back to 1661 and considered themselves the senior cavalry regiment. The Scots Greys had smashed Jacobite charges and French columns across decades of warfare. The Inniskillings had fought at the Boyne and every major British battle since. Together, the Union Brigade mustered approximately 2,500 cavalry on June 18, 1815, positioned in reserve behind the farm of La Haye-Sainte, in the centre of Wellington's line. Their tactical purpose was simple but demanding. Wait until French attacks broke through the infantry line, then counterattack to restore the position before the breakthrough could be exploited. This required patience, which wasn't cavalry's strong suit, and perfect timing, which was extraordinarily difficult to judge in the smoke and confusion of Napoleonic battle. British heavy cavalry had specific advantages over their French counterparts. The horses were larger and heavier, which meant they hit infantry formations with more physical force. British cavalry training emphasized the discipline of riding knee-to-knee in formation, creating a wall of horseflesh and steel that was psychologically terrifying even before impact. The swords were designed for slashing rather than thrusting, meant to cut down infantry who couldn't effectively defend against mounted attack. But heavy cavalry also had critical weaknesses. The horses tired quickly, especially in the mud-soaked fields of Waterloo. Once scattered, heavy cavalry were vulnerable to counterattack by lighter, fresher enemy horsemen. And most dangerously, heavy cavalry had a documented tendency to lose all discipline once they broke through enemy lines. Ponsonby knew these strengths and weaknesses intimately. He'd positioned himself not at the rear where most brigade commanders would direct operations, but at the front of his formation where he could lead the charge personally if it came to that. This was partly aristocratic tradition, officers led from the front to prove their courage, but also tactical calculation. Cavalry that saw their commander charging with them would follow more willingly, and Ponsonby's presence at the front meant he could make split-second decisions about direction and timing that couldn't be communicated by messenger. As the morning of June 18th wore on and French artillery began its bombardment, the Union Brigade waited in their positions, horses stamping nervously, men checking weapons and saddle girths. Ponsonby rode along his regiments, speaking to officers, making last adjustments to positioning. He had no idea that in a few hours he would lead these men to the greatest cavalry victory in British history, and that the victory would destroy them all. The morning of June 18th broke grey and miserable over Waterloo, the previous night's rain having turned the battlefield into a quagmire that would dictate everything about the coming battle. Mud wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a tactical factor that slowed infantry movement, made cavalry charges more exhausting, and caused artillery roundshot to plough into the ground rather than bouncing through formations. Wellington had positioned his Anglo-Allied army along the Mont Saint-Jean ridge, using the reverse slope to shelter his infantry from French artillery fire. 72,000 French soldiers faced 68,000 Allied troops across a shallow valley that was perhaps 1,400 yards at its widest point. Napoleon's strategy was brutally direct. Break Wellington's centre, split the Allied army, drive toward Brussels, and force the British to evacuate the continent before the Prussian army could arrive to reinforce them. Everything depended on speed. Every hour that passed brought Blucher's Prussians closer to the battlefield. The Union Brigade, positioned in the second line behind the ridge, could hear the French artillery bombardment begin around 11:30, a rolling thunder that meant soldiers were dying in the front lines, but also meant the decisive moment hadn't yet arrived. For Ponsonby and his cavalry, the morning was an agony of waiting. Cavalry in reserve had the worst position on any battlefield, close enough to hear the fighting, unable to see what was happening, knowing they'd be committed only when the situation was desperate. Soldiers checked and rechecked equipment, fed and watered horses, and tried not to think about what was coming. Officers studied the terrain they might have to charge across, calculating distances and identifying obstacles. Ponsonby moved between his regiments, projecting calm confidence whilst his experienced eye assessed the deteriorating battlefield situation through the sounds alone. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the nature of the artillery fire changed, becoming more intense and concentrated. This was the preparatory bombardment for d'Erlon's grand attack. 4 infantry divisions, roughly 16,000 to 18,000 men, formed into massive columns designed to smash through Wellington's centre by sheer weight. These weren't loose formations, but dense columns of men, each battalion packed shoulder to shoulder, multiple battalions formed one behind another. The column was supposed to combine firepower and shock, maintaining cohesion whilst advancing under fire and then overwhelming defenders through mass and momentum. But columns had a fatal weakness that Napoleon's marshals should have remembered from previous battles. They were magnificent targets for cavalry. A line of infantry could form square quickly, creating a hedgehog of bayonets that cavalry couldn't penetrate. A column, especially a massive column packed with thousands of men, couldn't easily transform into defensive formations. They were designed to march forward, not sideways or backward. And if cavalry hit them before they could deploy, the results would be catastrophic. As d'Erlon's divisions descended the French ridge and began crossing the valley, Allied infantry in the front lines opened fire. General Picton's division, positioned directly in the path of the French assault, delivered devastating volleys, but the French kept coming through sheer mass. Picton himself was killed by a musket ball through the temple. Allied infantry began to waver under the pressure. This was exactly the situation Wellington had positioned his cavalry to counter, the moment when infantry needed immediate support, or the line would break. The Earl of Uxbridge, commanding all Allied cavalry, made the decision. He would unleash the heavy brigades. A staff officer galloped toward Ponsonby with orders that would change everything. Attack now. Break the French columns. Save the infantry. Ponsonby's order cut through the tension like a sabre stroke. Forward the Union Brigade. 2,500 horsemen began moving, initially at a walk to maintain formation and allow the regiments to align properly. This wasn't a chaotic rush, but a controlled advance, knee to knee, each rider maintaining position relative to his neighbours, officers calling out corrections to keep the line dressed. They had to navigate through gaps in the Allied infantry line first, threading between battalions that were still engaged with the approaching French columns. One moment of confusion here, one regiment colliding with friendly infantry, and the entire formation would dissolve before it even reached the enemy. As the Union Brigade cleared their own lines and emerged onto the forward slope, Ponsonby accelerated the pace to a trot, then a canter. The ground was treacherous, muddy and torn up by artillery fire, littered with bodies and debris from earlier fighting. Horses struggled for footing, but the formation held. Ahead, perhaps 200 yards away, the French columns were still advancing, dense masses of blue-coated infantry with their eagles held high and drums beating the pace. These were veteran soldiers, many of whom had marched across Europe under Napoleon's command, and they'd seen cavalry charges before. But they'd never seen anything quite like what was bearing down on them now. From the French perspective, the sight must have been terrifying. A wall of horsemen, stretched across hundreds of yards, moving from canter to full gallop, the ground itself seeming to shake with the impact of thousands of hooves. The sound alone would have been overwhelming, not just the hoofbeats, but the jangling of equipment, the shouting of British officers, and underneath it all, the screams of men about to die. French officers began shouting orders to form square, the standard defensive formation against cavalry, but the columns were too massive, too unwieldy, packed too tightly together. There wasn't time. The British heavy cavalry was covering the final 50 yards at full gallop, 30 miles per hour or more, thousands of pounds of horse and rider about to hit infantry formations that were designed for forward momentum, not sideways defense. The impact came in sections as different regiments hit different portions of the French columns. The physics were brutal and simple. Horses at full gallop don't stop when they hit human beings, they go through them. The front ranks of French infantry tried to form some kind of defense, leveling muskets and fixing bayonets, but a musket ball might kill a horse or rider and still not stop the charging line behind. The British cavalry ploughed into the French columns like an axe into wood, splitting formations apart, trampling men under hooves, riders slashing downward with their heavy swords at soldiers who couldn't effectively fight back. Within seconds of impact, the French columns stopped being military formations and became mobs of panicked men trying to escape being crushed or cut down. The tight packing that was supposed to give them strength became a death trap. Soldiers in the center of the column couldn't even see what was happening. They just felt the formation disintegrating around them, heard the screaming, and started running. The French, who'd been advancing confidently minutes earlier, were now fleeing in terror, throwing away weapons and equipment, desperate to escape the swords and hooves. And the Union Brigade, tasting victory and seeing broken enemies before them, kept charging forward into the French lines, discipline beginning to fray, officers losing control, Ponsonby's careful plans starting to unravel, even as his tactical brilliance was achieving the impossible. The breakthrough became a rout within minutes. The Scots Greys, their grey horses making them highly visible across the battlefield, smashed completely through one French division and found themselves among enemy artillery batteries. Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Greys fought a desperate hand-to-hand combat with French soldiers defending the eagle of the 45th Lean Regiment, the eagle being one of the most sacred symbols Napoleon had distributed to his regiments. Ewart killed the eagle-bearer, fought off the accompanying colour party, and emerged from the melee with the eagle clutched in his hand, a trophy that would make him famous and the Scots Greys legendary. The Royal Dragoons and Inniskillings were achieving similar success across their sections of the French line. Entire battalions of French infantry were surrendering en masse, thousands of prisoners streaming toward British lines with their hands raised. French officers who tried to rally their men were cut down or captured. Artillery batteries that should have been protected by infantry support were overrun, their crews sabred as they tried to defend their guns. D'Erlon's grand assault, which had seemed unstoppable minutes earlier, had been completely destroyed. 4 full divisions rendered combat ineffective in less than half an hour. By any measure, this was a tactical masterpiece. 2,500 cavalry had routed roughly 16,000 infantry, inflicted thousands of casualties, captured 2 Imperial Eagles and several artillery pieces, and eliminated Napoleon's main attack. Wellington, watching from the ridge, must have been astounded. This was exactly what heavy cavalry was supposed to achieve. Decisive intervention at the critical moment, shattering enemy formations when infantry couldn't hold. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it justified every penny spent on maintaining expensive cavalry regiments. Ponsonby had vindicated his reputation as a thinking cavalry commander. He'd timed the charge perfectly, hit the French at their most vulnerable moment, and broken their assault decisively. But cavalry success carried within it the seeds of cavalry disaster. The Union Brigade was now 400 yards beyond the British lines, scattered across a wide front, intermixed with fleeing French infantry and captured prisoners. The neat formations that had begun the charge no longer existed. Regiments were jumbled together, men pursuing individual Frenchmen, horses blown and exhausted from galloping through mud whilst carrying armoured riders. Officers were trying to sound recall, to gather their scattered men and retire back to British lines before French reserves could counterattack. Some soldiers heard and tried to comply. Many others, their blood up and the enemy running before them, kept pursuing. This was the moment when Ponsonby's theoretical knowledge crashed against the reality of controlling excited men on exhausted horses. Every cavalry manual stressed the importance of rallying after a successful charge. Every commander knew that scattered cavalry were vulnerable, but knowing and doing were different things. Ponsonby himself was somewhere in the mass of horsemen, trying to use his personal authority to gather regiments that no longer existed as coherent units. And across the valley, French cavalry commanders were observing the scattered British and making their own calculations. 4,000 French lancers and cuirassiers, fresh troops on rested horses, began forming for their own charge. They'd watched the Union Brigade destroy d'Erlon's infantry. Now they were going to destroy the Union Brigade. And the exhausted British cavalry, scattered across enemy territory with blown horses and no formation, were about to learn that cavalry's greatest triumph could become cavalry's worst nightmare in the space of minutes. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The loss of cavalry control after a successful charge was a problem as old as mounted warfare itself. Roman cavalry had done it, medieval knights had done it, and now British heavy cavalry at Waterloo was repeating the same fatal mistake despite 2,000 years of military history warning against it. The psychology was straightforward. Men who'd just experienced the terror of charging into enemy formations, who'd seen their comrades killed, who'd been absolutely convinced they might die, suddenly found themselves victorious with fleeing enemies before them. The instinct to pursue, to ensure those enemies couldn't regroup, to take revenge for friends lost, was overwhelming. Adrenaline, bloodlust, the sheer intoxicating rush of victory, all of it combined to make rational decision-making nearly impossible. Ponsonby was experiencing this loss of control firsthand. His regiments had ceased to be regiments and become scattered groups of individual riders pursuing individual Frenchmen across a wide front. Trumpet calls for rally were being ignored or simply not heard in the chaos. Officers who tried to gather men found themselves with a dozen troopers when they should have had 100. The careful coordination that had made the charge successful had evaporated. Some men were already trying to return to British lines. Others were still pursuing French infantry, and many were simply lost in the smoke and confusion. Then the French counterattack hit. Lancers swept in from the flanks, their 9-foot weapons giving them devastating reach advantage over British cavalry swords. A lancer could impale a British trooper from beyond sword range, and the exhausted British horses couldn't maneuver away. Cuirassiers in their steel breastplates crashed into scattered groups of Union Brigade cavalry, their fresh horses and organized formations overwhelming exhausted individuals. The mathematical reversal was brutal. Minutes earlier, organized British cavalry had destroyed disorganized French infantry. Now organized French cavalry was destroying disorganized British cavalry. The killing became methodical. French cavalry didn't need to fight fair. They simply hunted down scattered British troopers who were trying to reach their own lines on exhausted horses. Lancers particularly excelled at this, using their reach to strike from behind or the side, killing men who couldn't effectively defend themselves. The British heavy cavalry swords, magnificent weapons for slashing at infantry, were less effective in cavalry versus cavalry combat, where the French had numerical advantage, fresh horses, and superior positioning. Ponsonby found himself in the nightmare scenario every cavalry commander feared, trying to extract his men from a losing fight whilst under attack himself. His horse, which had already carried him through the initial charge and the pursuit, was struggling. Eyewitness accounts differ on exact details, but the consensus was that Ponsonby's mount was so exhausted it could barely manage more than a laboured canter when it needed to gallop. French lancers identified him as an officer, probably from his uniform and position, and converged on him specifically. A general was worth capturing or killing, and Ponsonby was neither protected by formed troops nor able to escape on his failing horse. The mathematical inevitability of cavalry combat was playing out. Exhausted men on exhausted horses cannot defeat fresh men on fresh horses. Scattered individuals cannot defend against organized formations. The Union Brigade, which had achieved the impossible by breaking d'Erlon's corps, was now being systematically destroyed by the consequences of its own success. And William Ponsonby, who'd studied cavalry warfare for 20 years and knew exactly what was happening to his brigade, was about to become another casualty of the lesson he couldn't prevent his men from learning. The exact circumstances of William Ponsonby's death remain frustratingly unclear, obscured by the fog of battle and conflicting eyewitness accounts. What's certain is that French lancers caught him somewhere in the killing ground between French and British positions, on a horse too exhausted to escape, probably separated from most of his staff and without formed troops to protect him. Some accounts suggest he attempted to fight, wielding his sword against multiple opponents. Others indicate his horse stumbled or collapsed, leaving him vulnerable on foot. What matters is that lancers surrounded him and delivered multiple thrusts with their 9-foot weapons, wounds that were immediately mortal but didn't necessarily kill instantly. Here's where the story becomes particularly grim. Ponsonby wasn't killed outright by those initial lance strikes. He was grievously wounded, unable to move or defend himself, and left on the battlefield as French cavalry moved on to pursue other targets. He lay there in the mud, conscious but dying, surrounded by other wounded and dead men from both armies. The pain would have been extraordinary, lance wounds to the torso causing massive internal bleeding whilst the victim remained aware. He could hear the battle continuing around him, could see other wounded men struggling or dying, and knew with complete certainty that he was going to die far from his family. The controversial part of Ponsonby's final hours involves a soldier who allegedly found him still alive. The traditional account, probably embellished but possibly containing truth, describes a British soldier discovering the general, recognizing him or his uniform, and rather than rendering aid, stealing his watch and valuables before leaving him to die. Other versions suggest the soldier was French, or that Ponsonby was already dead when his possessions were taken. These details matter less than the broader truth. Battlefield looting was common, wounded officers were vulnerable to it, and Ponsonby died alone among strangers. He was found the next morning on June 19th, when parties moved across the battlefield identifying and collecting bodies. Staff officers who'd served with him identified the corpse. His personal effects, what remained of them, were recovered and would eventually be returned to his widow. The official record lists him as killed in action on June 18, 1815, though he may have survived into the night. His body was buried with other British officers who'd fallen at Waterloo, the location marked but not monumentally commemorated. The news reached his family through official channels, the War Office sending notification to his widow that Major General William Ponsonby had fallen in the great victory at Waterloo. She became one of hundreds of widows created that day, left to raise children without their father and to live on whatever military pension was provided for officers' families. The pension would have been adequate. Officers' widows weren't left destitute. But it was poor compensation for losing a husband at age 43, killed at the moment of his greatest professional triumph. Ponsonby's death notice appeared in newspapers alongside hundreds of other casualties from Waterloo. He was mentioned in dispatches for his role in the charge, but not extensively. Wellington's official report focused on the battle's grand strategic success, not on individual tragedies. Within weeks, Ponsonby was already becoming a footnote to the greater story of Waterloo, the commander who'd led a successful charge and died doing it, one among many brave officers lost in the victory. But the Union Brigade's butcher's bill wasn't finished being calculated, and the numbers would tell a story about cavalry warfare that military theorists would study for generations. The Union Brigade that rode forward with 2,500 men returned with fewer than 1,500. Casualty figures varied depending on how they were counted: immediate deaths, men who died of wounds later, prisoners taken by the French. But the most conservative estimates put losses at around 1,000 men, a 40% casualty rate. Some regimental tallies were even worse. The Scots Greys lost approximately half their strength, around 200 men from 400 engaged. The Royal Dragoons and Inniskillings suffered similarly devastating losses. Proportionally, officer casualties were even higher because officers led from the front and made conspicuous targets in their distinctive uniforms. The horses told their own grim story. Hundreds of cavalry mounts were killed or permanently disabled, and these animals represented years of breeding, training, and expense that couldn't be quickly replaced. A cavalry regiment without horses was simply expensive infantry, and the Union Brigade's mounted strength was effectively destroyed for the remainder of the campaign. Men who survived did so on exhausted horses that would need weeks to recover, assuming they recovered at all. The veterinary medicine of 1815 meant many wounded horses were simply destroyed as unfixable. But raw casualty numbers don't capture the complete picture. What matters is the exchange rate. What did those 1,000 casualties purchase? The Union Brigade had routed approximately 14,000 to 16,000 French infantry from d'Erlon's corps, inflicted 3,000 to 5,000 French casualties, captured 2 Imperial Eagles and several artillery batteries, and completely destroyed Napoleon's main attack on the Allied centre. By any military calculation, this was a favourable exchange. Losing 1,000 cavalry to eliminate 16,000 infantry and prevent a breakthrough would be considered acceptable in the brutal mathematics of Napoleonic warfare. Wellington's later comment about Waterloo, that nothing was more painful than winning a battle except losing one, reflected this complex reality. The Union Brigade's charge was simultaneously a brilliant tactical success and an operational disaster. It succeeded in its immediate mission of breaking the French assault, but destroyed itself in the process, removing British heavy cavalry from the battle when they might have been needed later. Had Napoleon managed to break through somewhere else in the afternoon, Wellington would have had no heavy cavalry reserve to counter it. The Union Brigade was spent. The debate about whether the charge was worth its cost began immediately after the battle and continues among military historians. Some argue Ponsonby achieved exactly what Wellington needed: decisive intervention that shattered Napoleon's best chance to break the Allied centre. Others contend that better control during the pursuit could have preserved more of the brigade for subsequent action. Both perspectives have merit. The charge worked tactically, but failed operationally because cavalry couldn't be controlled once committed. This duality, tactical success paired with operational failure, encapsulated cavalry's fundamental problem in Napoleonic warfare. Heavy cavalry could win battles in minutes, but only by accepting risks that often destroyed the cavalry itself. The weapon was so powerful, it was almost suicidal to employ, yet battles could be lost without employing it. Wellington had used his cavalry perfectly in terms of timing and positioning, and still lost 40% of them. Ponsonby had done everything right, charged at the right moment, hit the right targets, achieved the mission, and died along with hundreds of his men in the aftermath. The question military theorists would grapple with for decades afterward was simple. Could cavalry warfare's inherent contradictions ever be resolved? Or was this tragedy inevitable whenever heavy cavalry charged? Military professionals across Europe studied the Union Brigade's charge almost immediately after Waterloo, trying to extract lessons that could prevent future disasters whilst preserving cavalry's shock power. The fundamental problem was ancient. Cavalry that broke through enemy lines almost invariably became disorganized and vulnerable to counterattack. This had destroyed cavalry forces from antiquity through the Middle Ages and into the gunpowder era. The Union Brigade was simply the latest, most dramatic example of a phenomenon military theorists had documented for centuries. Historical parallels were instructive. At Edgehill in 1642, Prince Rupert's royalist cavalry had smashed through parliamentary forces, then pursued the broken enemy off the battlefield entirely, leaving the royalist infantry unsupported and nearly losing the battle. At Blenheim in 1704, Marlborough had solved this problem by holding cavalry reserves and designating rally points where disordered units could reform under fresh officers. Frederick the Great's Prussian cavalry doctrine emphasized iron discipline, with officers authorized to cut down their own men who pursued without orders. The tactical solution was known: maintain reserves, establish rally points, enforce discipline brutally. But implementing it in the chaos of battle remained extraordinarily difficult. Wellington himself had complicated views about cavalry that the Waterloo campaign reinforced. He famously remarked that British cavalry officers seemed to believe they could gallop through anything, and while this aggressiveness produced spectacular successes like the Union Brigade's charge, it also produced spectacular failures. His solution was to use cavalry sparingly, holding them in reserve until absolutely necessary, then accepting that once committed, they'd probably destroy themselves achieving their objective. This was pragmatic but wasteful, treating expensive cavalry as expendable shock troops rather than reusable assets. Post-Waterloo reforms in British cavalry training tried to address these problems. Greater emphasis was placed on controlled maneuvers and rallying procedures. Trumpet calls were standardized, so units across the army used identical signals. Reserve squadrons became doctrinal, with portions of cavalry brigades specifically held back to cover retreats and provide rally points. Officers received enhanced training in command and control, studying battles like Waterloo, where cavalry succeeded tactically but failed to preserve itself. Interestingly, British cavalry finally adopted lances in 1816, learning from the French weapons that had proven so effective in cutting down scattered Union Brigade troopers. But these reforms faced inherent limitations. The technology of 1815 meant commanders had no effective way to communicate with scattered cavalry beyond trumpet calls that couldn't be heard in battle noise and visual signals that couldn't be seen in smoke. Radio communication was a century away. Officers could give orders before the charge, but once cavalry committed, they were effectively uncontrollable until they either rallied themselves or were destroyed. This fundamental limitation wouldn't be solved until cavalry itself became obsolete. Later wars demonstrated the lessons remained unlearned. The charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava in 1854 showed British cavalry could still be wasted through poor command decisions. American Civil War cavalry evolved into mounted infantry, specifically to avoid cavalry's control problems. By World War I, cavalry was militarily obsolete, unable to operate in the face of machine guns and barbed wire. Modern armor and mechanized warfare would eventually solve cavalry's mobility and protection problems, but by then, the horse soldier was a historical curiosity. The Union Brigade's charge remained studied in military academies as the perfect example of cavalry's paradox: decisive power requiring perfect control in circumstances where control was impossible. Ponsonby's ghost haunted cavalry doctrine, a reminder that knowing what should be done and actually doing it were separated by a chasm that killed commanders and soldiers alike. William Ponsonby's historical legacy is one of near-complete obscurity, despite leading one of the most significant cavalry charges in British military history. Ask most people to name famous Waterloo commanders, and they'll mention Wellington, perhaps Blucher, possibly Picton, or the Earl of Uxbridge, who survived despite losing a leg. Ponsonby's name appears in specialist military histories and regimental chronicles, but he's absent from popular consciousness in a way that seems unjust given his achievement and sacrifice. Several factors explain this historical amnesia. The Earl of Uxbridge commanded all Allied cavalry at Waterloo and survived the battle, albeit minus his right leg from a near-miss artillery shell. Uxbridge's survival meant he could shape the narrative of cavalry actions at Waterloo through his own accounts and correspondence. He was also politically prominent as Marquess of Anglesey and remained in public life for decades after the battle. Ponsonby, by contrast, died on the battlefield and left no personal account, no memoirs, no opportunity to advocate for his own historical importance. Dead men don't write their own histories. The manner of Ponsonby's death also worked against his commemoration. He didn't die in a dramatic last stand like Picton, shot at the front of his division whilst rallying troops. He was cut down during the pursuit phase of a cavalry charge, dying inglorious in the mud, possibly robbed by looters, found the next day among hundreds of other corpses. There's nothing cinematic about such a death, nothing that translates into heroic poetry or dramatic paintings. Victorian Britain, which constructed elaborate mythologies around Waterloo, preferred heroes who died gloriously, not commanders who achieved brilliant success and then were killed in its chaotic aftermath. Wellington's official Waterloo dispatch mentioned the Union Brigade's charge and its success, but didn't extensively praise Ponsonby personally. This wasn't necessarily slight. Wellington's reports were typically understated, but it meant Ponsonby lacked the official accolades that elevated other officers to fame. His family received the honours appropriate for a fallen general, but there was no major monument, no public subscription for a grand memorial. He was buried with other British officers who fell at Waterloo, his grave marked but not monumentalised beyond standard military commemoration. Regimental histories remember the Union Brigade's charge extensively, particularly the Scots Greys' capture of the French Eagle by Sergeant Ewart. But these accounts focus on regimental heroism and specific dramatic moments rather than Ponsonby's overall command. The Eagle capture became legendary, immortalised in paintings and retellings. Ponsonby's tactical decision to charge at the precise right moment, which made the Eagle capture possible, faded into footnote status. Soldiers and specific acts of heroism were remembered. The general who enabled those acts was forgotten. Modern military historians have begun reassessing Ponsonby's achievement, recognizing his charge as a masterpiece of timing and positioning that achieved decisive results at the crucial moment. Academic studies of Waterloo acknowledge his tactical brilliance, but academic recognition doesn't translate into popular memory. There are no films about Ponsonby, no novels with him as protagonist, no dramatic retellings of his story in mass media. He remains what he's been since 1815, a footnote to the greater story of Waterloo, a name in casualty lists, a brief mention in cavalry warfare textbooks. The injustice is compounded by comparison to less successful cavalry commanders who achieved greater fame. Ponsonby broke D'Erlon's corps and saved Wellington's centre. His charge worked. Yet he's forgotten whilst commanders whose charges failed spectacularly sometimes became legendary. Military history, like all history, is written by survivors and shaped by narratives that satisfy cultural needs rather than accurately reflecting achievement. William Ponsonby's story encapsulates cavalry warfare's fundamental paradox. The most powerful weapon on the Napoleonic battlefield was also the most dangerous to employ. His achievement at Waterloo was extraordinary by any measure. 2,500 cavalry destroying 16,000 infantry, capturing Eagles, breaking Napoleon's main attack, and doing so at exactly the moment Wellington needed intervention. This wasn't luck or enemy incompetence. It was tactical brilliance born from 20 years studying how cavalry could be used effectively. Ponsonby timed the charge perfectly, positioned his brigade precisely, and executed the attack with devastating effect. His failure was equally instructive, though calling it personal failure misses the systemic nature of the problem. Ponsonby couldn't control his men once they broke through French lines because no cavalry commander in history had solved that problem with the technology and communication methods of 1815. Trumpet calls couldn't be heard in battle chaos. Visual signals couldn't be seen through smoke. Officers' shouted orders reached only those immediately nearby. Once cavalry scattered across a wide front in pursuit of fleeing enemies, they ceased being a military formation and became individuals whose behavior was governed by adrenaline, blood fury, and the intoxicating rush of victory rather than tactical discipline. The lessons extend beyond military history into any domain where success creates conditions for failure. In modern business terminology, this is mission creep, achieving an objective, then expanding operations beyond sustainable limits. In sports, it's the team that scores early, then overcommits to attack, leaving themselves vulnerable to counterattack. The principle of the culminating point, where offensive operations exhaust themselves and become vulnerable to reversal, applies to cavalry charges as much as corporate expansions or military campaigns. Ponsonby's story teaches that knowing when to stop is as important as knowing when to act, and that the hardest time to stop is when you're winning. His dual legacy as brilliant tactician and victim of cavalry's inherent nature should shape how we remember him. He wasn't a reckless fool who charged without thinking. He was a thoughtful commander who understood the risks and took them because the alternative was worse. Wellington's centre was breaking under d'Erlon's assault. Without cavalry intervention, the Allied line might have collapsed, potentially losing the battle and changing European history. Ponsonby had to attack, and he did so with tactical excellence that achieved everything possible. That his men then couldn't be controlled wasn't unique to him. It was cavalry warfare's eternal problem that no commander of that era could solve. The human cost demands acknowledgement. The Union Brigade's casualties were husbands, fathers, sons, families destroyed for strategic objectives. Ponsonby himself left a widow and children who would grow up without their father. The French soldiers killed by the charge were also human beings with families and lives cut short. War's brutality doesn't diminish by calling it necessary or successful. The charge worked militarily, but that doesn't make the deaths less tragic. William Ponsonby deserves remembrance as one of Wellington's finest cavalry commanders, a man who achieved the impossible at Waterloo and died in victory's aftermath. His story should stand alongside those of more famous commanders, not because it's uplifting, but because it's instructive. Brilliance and tragedy aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same moment viewed from different perspectives. The greatest cavalry charge in British history killed its commander, and both the triumph and the tragedy deserve recognition. If this story taught you something about military history, leadership under pressure, or the complexity of success and failure, share it in the comments. Hit that like button for Ponsonby's forgotten legacy. Subscribe for more military history that deserves to be remembered. And let us know, what other brilliant commanders has history unfairly forgotten?